Okay, so now that I have my sketch pretty well mapped out and my reference photo, I can get to the painting portion of this. So I just have some Prang watercolors here. These are pretty okay for student grade watercolors. I do have, watercolors really vary in quality, but these are acceptable. The more expensive the watercolor, generally the more highly pigmented, the more intense the colors are going to be. What I really recommend doing as you're painting is always have a scrap piece of watercolor paper for testing out your colors. And you should always have a mixing area for your watercolors. So sets like this, you typically mix your colors in the lid. If you don't have somewhere to mix your colors, you can use just a white plate. But it's really good to have something with some smaller divisions of space. So if you have a palette that has wells in it, such as a plastic palette like this, that works great. So yeah, you're going to need to be able to mix some different colors. So with any watercolor, you're always going to want to work light to dark. So I think I'm going to start with the sky area, and this sky color is not a pure blue. There's sort of a little bit of a greenish tinge to it. Generally, you don't want to use colors that are straight from the palette because they're just too vibrant, a little too sort of cartoony. So it's always good to just tone them down slightly and just make them a little bit more customized to your needs. Now, depending on how much area you have to paint with a color, you want to mix up an appropriate amount of paint so that you don't run out as you're trying to tackle the area. Looks pretty good. And then it's always good to test out your color and see how it looks compared to your source. So here I have this blue tone and I'm matching it up to my sky, and it's a little bit too greenish, I think, so I'm gonna add a little bit more. Oh, that is too much purple. So it's always kind of a balancing act going between your colors. Okay, I'm gonna test this out again. It's looking a little better, maybe a little bit more of a purple tone, maybe a little bit more, add a little bit of red. So it's a warmer color. That looks pretty good. Now, as I'm painting, when I paint a sky, I want to avoid the clouds at first. So I'm sort of just painting the negative spaces in between the clouds. And I'm starting with a really, really diluted color so that I can kind of just define this area of wash first. Now that I have it on my paper, it looks a little too purple, but we'll deal with that. So I'm following my very rough cloud sketch here, and I'm also kind of trying to follow the shapes of the clouds in my reference. It's always good to have some paper towels near you as well. I can use them to kind of soften the edges. And I can darken certain areas. While it's still wet, it's easy for me to blend some colors together. Kind of drop some more of those colors in. It's actually a bit easier to paint this way, painting the negative shapes, because you're able to, and I mean, these are such abstract shapes, your brain doesn't really get in the way of imagining what something should look like, but thinking about painting what you see and not what your brain imagines it's supposed to look like. Now I'm going to get some of this color and really dilute it so that I can paint some of the inner parts of the clouds. And really take almost all of that color away so that I can get some of those shadowy shapes. I recommend that you use black really sparingly. It can kind of make your tones feel a little more dead. And of course, you don't have to go for perfect accuracy, but you want to really get a sense of the feeling of what you're painting. So here I'm trying to paint these sort of shadows of the underclouds. Also, I would recommend, and I did not do this, but I would recommend taping the edges of your piece so that with some not very sticky tape, take some masking tape and stick it to yourself and then stick it to the edges so that you don't have to worry about painting outside of the borders of your piece. Okay. So that's sort of the base of my sky here. I think it's looking pretty good. Yeah. Then from here, I think I'm going to tackle some of the greenery shapes. Now, green is a color that I always caution everyone, don't just use this color. This is such a kindergarten sort of green color. So you could start with this as a base, or you could mix your own new green color just from blue and yellow. And that will already give you a much more subtle green tone. This is just so much more realistic than this green tone here. So I have this sort of base green, and then I can create some sort of offshoot green tones as well. I can make a bluer green. I could tone it down with maybe a little bit of, oh, too much purple. That's my problem today, just too much purple. I can use the complementary color of green, which is red, to add, to make it darker and make it more toned down, less saturated. So this gives me sort of a grayish, greenish color. And I can use this for some shadows, maybe a little bit more blue. Yeah, so I can use that sort of as a shadow tone. And this one I can use for my base green tone. Yeah, so this works pretty well as the lighter shade in the plants, and this can be a good shadow tone. So as always, I'm going to work from light to dark, so I can start with just kind of laying in really basic kind of blobs of tone here. That's actually a little bit darker than I want it to be. So I'm going to add a little bit of pure yellow to that. That sort of brightens it up a bit. And I'm sort of shifting my green tones as I'm painting. I'm adding a little bit more yellow in some places, a little bit darker greens in some places, but this is really just my first layer. This reference is, it's easy because I have so much green going on, but it's also a little bit challenging defining what is what exactly. I'm going to start adding a little bit of my darker tones to give a little bit of definition while it's still wet. So here I can start to define some of those shadows underneath, and hopefully it's wet enough that it will kind of soften the edges and blend in a little bit. I really love painting with sort of the side of the brush rather than just the tip, and it helps to get some of those leafy kind of textures, make these sort of organic shapes. It's always tempting to try and get more control with watercolor, but you really should try and let the watercolor kind of do its own thing a little bit sometimes. And that will, you don't want to fight it basically. You don't want to try to force it into doing exactly what you want. You want to give it a little bit of breathing room, if that makes sense. Now this darker green is present in this area down here as well. So I'm going to go straight in with this slightly darker green. And the lighter green as well in these bushes here. You can see how I'm using the side of the brush to kind of smoosh out these shapes. And yeah, kind of defining some of those textures as I go along as well. Okay. And this is going to be the trunk of the tree, so it's going to be much darker, so I can paint over it as long as I remember where it is. Getting some deeper shadows back here. I don't want to get too dark on this first layer. I can always go back and deepen these shadows. I'm just kind of getting the base tones down right now. When I switch colors, I wipe off my brush with my paper towel. It's just or I can also wash it in my water and then wipe it off with a paper towel. You don't want to dramatically change the level of water that you have in your brush. Okay, looking pretty good. Then carry on these tones behind the pavilion as well, in between. Okay. So this is more of a vibrant yellowish green right in here. Really liven that up. And over here as well. I'm actually going to use a little bit of this intense kindergarten green color. Add that over here. So you can see this area of green is more saturated, more intense. So I'm actually using some of the, I like to call it kindergarten green, I guess. Using some of that mixed with my yellow. I'm ignoring the human figures in this picture because they don't really add to my photo. And it's okay if I don't get the edges of this perfect because it's a darker color. Now if these were, now I'm getting a little bit of brown and mixing with my yellow to create this tone over here. And I'm not going for the details of the leaves yet. I'm just looking at what is the base tone of that area and kind of laying that in, and then we'll go from there. Up in here is more of a darker tone again, so I'm going to lay in my darker green. Okay. So I'm not worrying about tiny details, but I am worrying about the general tone of each area, each zone. So I'm laying down a base tone as accurately as possible to that color. Some of the trickier colors to mix might be things like the metal color and the rock color. I really recommend to not rely on the black. I really recommend to kind of mix your own black and or mix your own neutral colors. And you can do that by mixing pairs of complementary colors together. So I could start with yellow and add a bit of purple until I get a complementary mix, which is going to turn into a brownish color. And that is a nice neutral brown. And even this kind of neutral brown is much nicer than the brown that comes in the kit. I'm trying to use this brown tone throughout to add color harmony. So I've mixed up this brown tone using my complementary colors. I added a lot of water, so it's very diluted. And I am looking at this brown, is this sort of beige tone is present in a lot of areas. So I'm laying in a base tone of this color kind of all over the place. It's even present in here because these metal guardrails are reflecting the stones around them. So I'm gonna carefully lay in a base tone of this in some areas where I see it in the metal. You can already see the pieces starting to shape up a little bit as I'm doing this. You can see I'm always changing the angle of my hand as I'm painting to be able to better define my edges. Don't be afraid to move your piece around, change the angle of your hand. If something feels awkward as you're painting it, just change it. Just change how you're working, because you can really cripple yourself if you're trying to just paint in the same position all the time. My drawing's a little inaccurate here. I should have erased that. Oh well. Okay, so this is a good start. Like I said, I'm laying in the base tones of the lighter colors first. And yeah, we'll go from there.